Joining us, the U.S. is planning to pull out of a landmark arms treaty with Russia as the Trump administration ramps up its criticism of the Kremlin this weekend. The president said Saturday that Russia has repeatedly violated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. The Cold War-era deal limited the development of certain types of weapons. The deal marked the first time the superpowers had excluded an entire category of nuclear arms and introduced on-site inspections.
We're not going to let them violate a nuclear agreement and go out and do weapons, and we're not allowed to. We're the ones that have stayed in the agreement, and we've honored the agreement, but Russia has not, unfortunately, honored the agreement. So we're going to terminate the agreement. We're going to pull out. If they get smart, and if others get smart, and they say, let's not develop these horrible nuclear weapons, I would be extremely happy with that. But as long as somebody's violating that agreement, then we're not going to be the only one to adhere to it.
Now, other nuclear-armed nations, including China, are not included in the deal. No official decision has been made yet to leave the treaty. The announcement comes as foreign policy takes center stage just weeks out from the midterms. Meanwhile, the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi and the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia was a main focus of the Sunday morning shows. Here is some of what you may have missed.
He's now crossed the line, and there has to be a punishment and a price paid for that. And again, I'm not rushing to judgment. Do I think he did it? Yes, I think he did it.
You don't bring a bone saw to an accidental fist fight inside an embassy in Turkey or a consulate in Turkey. So the Saudis have said a whole bunch of crap that's not right, accurate, or true.
This ought to be a relationship-altering event for the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, that we ought to suspend military sales. We ought to suspend certain security assistance.
When we ought to do it tomorrow morning, we ought to formally expel the Saudi ambassador from the United States until there is a completion of a third-party investigation into this kidnap, murder, and God knows what followed that occurred in Istanbul.
The president says he will stay in the treaty only if Russia and China, which was not a signatory to the INF treaty, will abide by its terms. Your reaction to this, sir?
I think it's a big, big mistake to flippantly get out of this historic agreement that Reagan and Gorbachev signed. This was a big part of Reagan's legacy, and we should not get rid of it.
I want to bring in Kevin Cirilli. He's the chief Washington correspondent from Bloomberg. Kevin, what does pulling out of this arms deal, this nuclear treaty, rather, mean for U.S. security?
Well, Tony, three things. First and foremost, this was a $110 billion commitment that the president had announced in 2017 during his first international trip abroad, which was, of course, Saudi Arabia. Now, only several billions of those dollars have actually trickled into Saudi Arabia and have been completed. But the second point is that the president, in contrast to what we just heard from Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, has said publicly over the last several days that he's very apprehensive to do that. He's linking this to the supply chain here domestically, that it would negatively impact jobs in the U.S. Now, he has floated numbers from 500,000 to 1 million. The White House has not provided how they are making those calculations on jobs. But from a supply chain impact, Boeing, as well as other major U.S. manufacturers, definitely are impacted by the geopolitical expansion into emerging markets such as Saudi Arabia. But the third point that I would make is that whether it's Kentucky Senator Rand Paul or Senator Bob Corker, there is growing concern about how specifically the U.S. relationship with the Saudis is going to impact the broader Middle Eastern question. And really, in this global chess game of Middle Eastern politics, you have the Saudi relationship that have been trending more positively to the U.S.'s most important ally in the Middle East, Israel. They had been trending toward a more positive, warm relationship because of their mutual enemy of Iran. And now you have a situation where the Saudis are facing intense questions because of what happened in Turkey, which had been trending toward Russia and away from NATO. And the biggest unknown in this is Qatar. So it's a very complex dynamic right now, particularly with the Qataris trying to now suggest that maybe if the Saudis are not going to be the U.S. ally in the region, they could take that spot.
Kevin, I want to get to the caravan that's making its way to the U.S.-Mexico border. But first, I want to sneak in a question about the nuclear treaty that Trump is talking about pulling out of. How might that impact the relationship between the U.S. and Russia moving forward?
Well, it would very much impact the relationship. This was something that the president had said back on the campaign trail, Tony, that he would have liked to see some type of getting rid of nuclear weapons, and that would ultimately be his final goal. Now, we've all seen the relationship between President Trump and President Putin. It has been deeply criticized, deeply talked about, to put it mildly. In terms of this particular nuclear disarmament deal, should he pull out of it, it would raise significant questions about the role of the United Nations. It would also raise significant questions about the role of the U.S. role in the international peace treaties beyond that. But this president has said that he does not have, he has a penchant, rather, for speaking critically of international treaties.
Now, moving to the dramatic pictures coming out of Mexico, this caravan of migrants heading toward the U.S.-Mexico border. The president has said he will not hesitate to put the military on the U.S. border to secure it. He's also blaming Democrats for what he calls weak laws on immigration. Clearly, he thinks this is a big issue for the midterms. Do you think it is, in fact, a big issue with voters right now?
Well, it's all about the base. I mean, the politics of this, Tony, is definitely something that the president has in mind. Just with two plus weeks out until the midterm elections, they feel that the issue of immigration is going to be something that will help to mobilize conservative voters. There are Democrats that I talked to who suggest that it could have that effect for them as well. From the bottom line with regards to the midterms is that there hasn't been a major event since the confirmation of Justice Kavanaugh that has changed the contours of this race, with the Senate likely leaning Republican and the House likely flipping to Democrats. But I want to move to the policy of this, because the policy of this immigration debate, particularly with those thousands of folks flooding into Mexico and trying to get to the U.S. from Central America, really is important. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo recently met a couple of days ago in Mexico City with Mexican officials. And that's really the crux of this, whether you're a Democrat or whether you're a Republican. Panama, Guatemala, the Chinese investment, billions of dollars of Chinese investment pouring into Panama with no terms on these deals. Then you have outside forces in Central America who are trying to divide and uproot some of the Central American government. The economic situation on Mexico's southern border to Central America is dire. So you have all of these immigrants crossing through Mexico with no reason to stay in Mexico, no economic appetite from that perception at all. And that's really, I think, the inconvenient truth, so to speak, that here in the U.S., I think often domestically we've made this such a politically polarizing issue that we've forgotten to talk about really what's going on in the ground in Central America, which does impact here in the U.S.
Let's jump to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who was apparently confronted by some voters at a restaurant in Kentucky on Friday. The president has been happy with such moments because it allows him to capitalize them. Let's take a listen to what he's been saying and then talk about it on the other side.
You don't hand matches to an arsonist, and you don't give power to an angry left-wing mob, and that's what they've become.
Why might referring to the Democrats as a mob be an effective strategy for the White House?
You know, this really started following the confirmation of Justice Kavanaugh. When I was up there on Capitol Hill that week, there were a dozen, I would argue, hundreds of protesters, thousands even outside of the Capitol. But inside of the actual halls of Congress where we report, there were, I would say, probably 100 or so daily protesters who were approaching mostly Republican lawmakers in similar incidents that we saw to the viral moment of the one with the Senate Majority Leader. I interviewed Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell earlier this week, and I asked him about sort of the climate and the situation, and he said that he believes that the Justice Kavanaugh confirmation was a quote-unquote shot of adrenaline to the base of the Republican Party.
You know, the president also said this weekend, and this is kind of rich, that Republican lawmakers are working on a, quote, major tax cut for the middle class.
Just in
time for the midterms. It's going to be unveiled in the coming weeks. How realistic is this new legislation in a lame duck session, and what do you think of the timing?
Well, I mean, they can unveil it in the next 2 weeks, but I mean, literally, there's no lawmakers to vote on it here in the lame duck session. I'm sorry, and here they're in recess in the lame duck session, or the period of Congress after the midterm elections. Tony, I think I would find it very hard pressed to see if a major type of tax reform package would be able to get done. I think this is largely what we would call here inside of the Beltway a messaging bill.
All right, Kevin Cirilli of Bloomberg, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate it.